Welcome to Reading the Bible with Pastor. Today we're on Esther chapter 2, starting at verse 12. We had previously heard about two of the main characters in Esther, Esther herself and Mordecai. We're now going to read about King Ahasuerus choosing a wife. And this goes through a whole process here, but the main point that I want you to hear in this first section is that what Esther did specifically different from the other women and how she is elevated to queen. So let's begin. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. You can think of this as a year-long spa treatment. But this is, as good as that sounds, this is not the way that God intended for marriage to happen. God wanted us to be one woman and one wife, monogamous relationship for life. Here what we see is that King Ahasuerus is going to have many women that he is going to have that can serve him come into his bedchamber, concubines, and a harem of women. That's not what God intended. Nonetheless, this is what man has done to the sanctity of marriage, but God is going to work in this, even though there is sin in this world. So we'll continue with verse 13. When the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace, so she could take an instrument or whatever might woo the king into saying, "She's the one." In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shahazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again, unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. So if the king said, she is good for my pleasure, but not good enough to be a wife, she would go into the harem of concubines and would remain there in the second house. Most of the time, she would not return back to the king. She would get one chance. Esther is going to get this chance to be queen to King Ahasuerus, and that's what we're going to read about here in verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. She didn't take what she thought would be beneficial. She listened to the wisdom of those around her, including Haggai, to take what the king might find interesting, or what might he take pleasure in hearing or doing or whatnot. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So he found favor in her and made her queen. Note here, real quick, is the 10th month, which is Tebeth in the Hebrew calendar. This would have been a time for late planting and also the weeding in the here in the late fall. And so we're kind of getting a sense of this is in God's plan in his time, not by the Persian calendar, but by the calendar set forth by God. And we're going to continue to see how God's influence, his role in this, continues to show that he is influencing our lives, not just Esther's as well. So here in the 10th month, we might see that this is a new crop coming in, Esther being made queen by God's will. Then the king, in verse 18, then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So, imagine that everybody is going to enjoy Esther as queen. They don't have to pay taxes. And there's another feast on top of the feast and party that he gave for 180 days. King Ahasuerus is really showing his power, and here it says his royal generosity. Now, verse 19. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. It shows that she seeks wisdom from those around her. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. We're not entirely sure why they were angry at King Ahasuerus. Maybe they were told to do something they didn't want to do, or their power was taken away from them. But nonetheless, they wanted to kill King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. Notice it's Queen Esther now. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. Now, this gallows, you might be thinking of a rope gallows, but this was probably a spiked pillar in which the people would put on a wooden spike and left there to die. Often this is thought that this might be the predecessor to the Roman crucifixion. And then finally we'll end here. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This is important, this verse 23, that this moment was recorded into the annals of the king so that it could be looked at, reviewed, and brought back up if needed. So this is an important event in the book of Esther, and we'll see how it plays out later in the book. So next time we'll pick up with Esther chapter 3, and we'll see you then.